office in Mesot that work in the bordered area. So one country can have multiple offices, the headquarters, admin offices, regional offices, and that's why we have about 590 offices worldwide, and it continuously increases depending on interventions that are due. So you'll see at the bottom, probably one of my most favorite photos from the archives here at IOM, a very, very early photo back from the 50s when we were supporting the relocation of migrants from Europe. And then there's a little map on the top right. I'm sorry you have to squint, but it'll show you all the countries that the regional office here in Bangkok covers. There are 9 regional offices around the world for IOM. UN agencies generally are structured similarly, but some regional offices cover a different set of countries. So RO Bangkok, we reach 40 countries, extending all the way from Tehran to Nuku'alofa. Does anybody know where Nuku'alofa is? I'll be very impressed with any geography enthusiasts here. No, you can put it in the chat section. To be honest, I didn't know where Nuku'alofa was until I started working at IOM, so that is over in Tonga. So as you can see, we cover 9 time zones. There are 5,000 of us here in the region. We are currently involved in approximately 300 project implementation. And so it's a very big region, and I'm speaking just about the Asia Pacific. We are, of course, worldwide. So that, in a nutshell, is what IOM is about. Now, where does migration fit into SDGs, and where then does IOM's contribution come in the SDGs? This Agenda 2030 is a shared agenda, and as you know, given your coursework, it's not seen and it's not advocated as a set of goals that's exclusively for the UN to pursue. These are goals that have been identified, articulated as ones that would help the whole world move forward in achieving sustainable development, but is not deemed the exclusive responsibility of the UN agency. And so member states, the private sector, civil society are key partners in moving forward. We are in the decade of action. COVID has really hampered a lot of the achievements. There was acceleration in certain SDGs, which COVID really put a break to. And so this decade of action, as you know, is a really highly urgent decade for us, not just IOM, not just the UN, but really for the global family. So then if we look back to 2015, when these SDGs were identified, we'll see that migration and migrants are, for the first time really in the history of such a global set of goals, we see migrants exclusively mentioned and migration identified as a key component, as a key piece of sustainable development. And this is because migrants have not just become topical in recent years. Of course, at IOM, we've been working with migrants on migrations for decades now. It's not only become topical, but it's become increasingly evident that any sort of development initiative absolutely has to include, consider, cooperate with, and keep migrants at the front and center. We're not competing with other demographics. We're not saying put women behind migrants, put them behind forward. We're not doing any of that. What we're saying is, alongside a lot of key demographics and sectors, migration and migrants absolutely need to be put in the front. The reason I say this is because we see 17 SDGs here, and if I'm very honest, it's also my job because I work at IOM, it's very hard to say which SDGs does migration not fit into? Which SDGs then is IOM not at all responsible for? As I said, not just the IOM, not just UN, but there are many actors invested in and committed to pursuing the SDGs. So it's not just IOM, but if we look closely and we study the 17 SDGs, the 169 targets that comprise the SDGs, we'll see that migration is directly referenced in 5 SDGs. So if you look at the table to the left, migrants are explicitly referenced in 5 SDGs. But when we study the targets, when we consider the issue at hand, when we consider the partnerships that's necessary, and we consider the demographics and the beneficiaries that we want to reach, then the 2 tables on the right gives you a sense of how really every single SDG includes migrants and includes migration. This awakening to the importance of including migration and migrants is really timely, not just because of the recent years' shift in trends where this has become topical, but also because at IOM for decades now we've been advocating that based on our research, based on our interventions, based on our partnerships and the success we've seen in achieving sustainable development with our member states, where migration governance is well formulated, where there is a whole of society approach, partnering with both the central level government, subnational governance, civil society, where migrants are consulted, we see genuine improvement and contribution to sustainable development. So as an example, what COVID demonstrated to us was that migrants actually are an incredibly resilient demographic. This is something we at IOM have been lobbying for a long time, but during COVID, I think you have a very international student body there, so you might recall your own home country's stories during COVID, where migrant workers not only continued to remit back to their families, but also happened to surprise everyone, including World Bank experts, by increasing the volume of remittance. Just when work was drying up, just when things were getting desperate, migrant workers really stepped in and provided life-saving support for their immediate families. It continued to fuel economies. It continued to support community development. And so, especially in COVID, so just in the last 2 years, there's been a whole new amount of respect, I would say, for migrants and migration to see that connection. Migrants are not only just working for themselves, but when we, as an example, work to lower remittance costs, so that the funds being transferred actually reach the intended households and community. What is done with that money not only helps the immediate household, but also the community. And so suddenly we've seen this huge resurge in prioritizing and including migrants and migration in development initiatives. This, of course, is based on sound migration governance, sound migration framework. And this is why at IOM, our mantra for the longest time has been to ensure migration is safe, it's orderly, it's dignified, and it's regular. Over the years, over the decades, this then is the contribution we bring not just to the field of migration, but to the UN family to bring forward our expertise, our work in identifying how is it and why is it the case that we consider and we work with migrants. So next slide. Sorry, did you want to ask a question then?
Yes. I'm sorry to interrupt your presentation, but could you switch to the full screen slideshow? Is it very difficult for us to see the whole table content?
I did admit I am not good on Zoom. Let me take a look. Is there a way is this view options?
I think it's something from a display setting or...
Okay, let me try and reshare. Thanks for catching that. Were you able to follow the slides though? Is that better? No.
Is it still not appear?
Nope. Huh. Okay. Let me try again. I also split screen.
Sharing screen on Zoom is always hard. I have my struggles at every lecture. So.
You're very generous. I doubt that's true, but I'll take.
Yes, it's
okay.
on.
Is this better?
Oh, no? There we go. Yes, it's better. Thank you. Better, but we also get subtitles.
Let me see. How do I stop that? Well, at least it's a process. Maybe we'll keep the subtitles then. I actually can't see you anymore, so please turn on your audio if you need to stop me at any point. Okay, so let me return to my place in the slides. Right. So where was I? Okay, so what does IOM do exactly? We can talk about migration, we can talk about migrants, and oftentimes what I realize is everybody understands migration, understands who they think is a migrant, who counts as a migrant based on their individual perspective, which is completely fine because migration by area is a very cross-cutting theme, and the subject, migrants, there isn't a universally agreed definition of what constitutes a migrant. So I think we have a number of international students currently in Hanoi, is that correct? So I actually can't see you. Maybe in the chat.
Yes.
Yeah. Does that block your view? I opened up the chat here. No?
No.
Okay.
Oh. I think everybody has to. Right. Go ahead.
Okay, good. Thanks. So if you are a student, an international student, you are definitely a migrant. Generally, what we've come to agree on is a loose definition of counts as a migrant. So if you have shifted your usual place of domicile. So for international students here today, if you were living in Hong Kong and then you moved to Vietnam and you've been there for a year, we would consider you a genuine migrant. But even if there is a shorter term movement of 3 months or so, we consider this demographic to be a migrant. So it's really just about moving from your usual place of residence to a new place of residence. So what this means is migrants can be voluntary. I assume most of you students voluntarily opted to physically or at least virtually relocate from your country of origin or the last country you were living in to Vietnam. At the same time, we see a lot of forced migration as well. We have internally displaced persons who are displaced within one country, possibly due to natural disasters, possibly due to conflicts and civil strife. And we also have long-term relocation. We have families that decide to relocate entirely from one country and make a new country home. We have migrants like myself who live for a few years in one country and then move to the next for a few years. And so migrants can be a very all-encompassing term. This isn't to say that it's an unimportant term, but it's to show that migrants and therefore migration can include a very, very broad range. We're talking about people who have been trafficked or smuggled and want support to return home or want assistance in holistic reintegration when they return to their countries of origin. We're talking about people who anticipate that with climate change, so sea level rise, with soil salination that affects livelihoods, they may not need to move tonight, but they know that in the next 10, 15, 20 years, with soil erosion, with sea level rise, where they are living, it will no longer be viable, and so there's long-term relocation plans. This then also includes migrant workers and those working on remittances. At IOM, it also includes emergency response planning. If you know that there isn't a displacement plan, but you know that there are floods likely to occur at a certain point in the year in certain parts of the country, there's emergency planning that takes place. This also includes migration health. There's a lot of verification that goes into the health of migrants before they move, especially with COVID. We've all been witness to this, and not only do we have to show our vaccine certificate, but we have to prove our health before we move across borders. And then, of course, borders itself. During COVID itself, IOM provided a lot of training at border checkposts to border officials at points of entry to ensure that passport verification continues, which is traditional border management, but also maintains hygiene standards and COVID protocol to avoid the further spread of COVID. And so migrants and migration is a really broad cross-cutting area. So that text box on the right-hand side, it'll show you the thematic areas that we at IOM have organized our interventions around. Many times this can be cross-cutting, it can be overlapping. So at IOM, this is what we're doing. Now, a little bit backwards, but to the left, you'll see how then does IOM do what we do. As a member of the UN family, we officially joined in 2016. We participate in not just the UN country team meetings, but also the joint UN programming partnerships. So discussions on high-level policy, all the way to identifying the details and implementing projects directly itself. As I said earlier, IOM's approach is to prioritize a whole of society approach. So we work with governments, we work with community leaders, we work directly with diaspora and migrants. We also work with other UN agencies. We also collaborate with the private sector, with civil society, and at the same time, there are many initiatives that IOM alone is designing and delivering. And so this is, in a nutshell, all that we do. Sorry, I can't see any more, but if anybody has a question, feel free to turn your audio on. Okay. Then my work at IOM. So as I mentioned, here at IOM, we are a very big organization. There are, like I said, about 5,000 personnel across the 40 countries in the Asia-Pacific region. And of course, at IOM, we have a whole slew of expertise and skills. We have colleagues that are working on finance, on admin, on ICT. We, of course, have colleagues who are programmatic experts or program officers, experts in the making, on emergencies, on labor and human development, on migrant protection. But my work in particular is focused sort of in 4 areas. The first would be as head of the Regional Project Support Unit. I lead the unit that coordinates and builds internal capacity on 3 areas: project development, monitoring, evaluation, and reporting. As I mentioned, we are in 40 countries implementing at this very moment about 300 projects. So it's a lot of coordination. We have to coordinate with finance admin on the budget, with procurement on procurement, with ICT, with member states, with our regional thematic specialists, and so it's a lot of coordination. So what my unit does is coordinate between. So for example, when there's a project proposal being developed, we work to ensure that it is being reviewed by the relevant technical specialists, that it meets institutional standards, that it is in line with IOM's mandate, and so we work with country offices, we work with the regional office, we work with chief submission, we work with project managers, and most of my time is spent coordinating between the 15 units in the regional office, the 40 countries in the region, and of course headquarters and other donor capitals. So we work very much on supporting, coordinating project development, and once projects are active, up and running, on monitoring, evaluation, and reporting. So we focus also on building staff capacity around these areas. Project development is a key skill, especially at IOM. We are a projectized UN, which means that we are involved in policy, but we are also implementing directly. So project development is a big asset for anybody who is interested in working at IOM, anybody who wants to build a career at IOM. So if you have experience in writing proposals, concept notes, submitting grants, developing expressions of interest, that's a key skill, and that's something that my unit trains IOM staff on doing, but also on meeting quality on that. So on project development, and then during project implementation, there is robust monitoring and evaluation so that we're continuously implementing a project that meets the intended goals in a manner that is universally agreed to be fair, to be appropriate, and then we report. Reporting is a key area in international development. We do not work in a vacuum. We do not get to do whatever we want, however we want. We are held accountable to ourselves, to our mandate, to our member states, as well as to donors. And so these are the 3 areas. As I mentioned, doing this is something that has to be done with a slew of different cohorts, special thematic specialists, resource management officers, chief submission, and so forth. This then means that a lot of my time is focused on training and coordinating, and I'm working very closely with other staff inside IOM, but also because I have an overview of projects across the thematic areas across the region. I also organize briefings with our partners. So I join our regional director in informing partners, existing partners or potential partners about the work that we do so that we can then capitalize on our strengths. IOM's greatest asset and contribution to the joint UN family is that we are operationally very large and very present. As I mentioned, we have 590 offices around the world. And so in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, a few months ago, actually a year ago, there was a huge flood in Timor-Leste. A few weeks ago now, there was a hurricane in Tonga. We are already physically present there. We have boots on the ground. We have resources. We have offices, which means we have a system. We have a channel to send funds. We have people to recruit staff to provide immediate support after an emergency. And so I spend a lot of my time working with our regional director, with our thematic specialists to communicate to partners. And partners just does not only mean donors, but also the government as to what is it that IOM can bring. There are dozens and dozens of UN agencies and a plethora of actors in international development. So it's really important that we don't duplicate, we don't waste resources, and instead we are able to identify what is our individual area of expertise, which for IOM would be migration, and what is it that is our individual strength. So for IOM, it could be operational presence. So this is usually how I spend my day. A lot of coordinating, a lot of briefing, a lot of talking points for donors from member states. I think this is very niche, so maybe I can move to the next and final section, and then feel free to ask me questions. I think we're doing okay on time. Okay. So career suggestions. You're already in, I would say, the right master's course. The coursework that you're doing is preparing you to understand current context, current events, the needs, and also the shifting priorities of governments, of communities. And so I think you already have a strong foundation in the broader area of work of international development, of diplomacy. So I thought today I would instead share with you some tips. We are often asked, how can I get my foot in the door? And I know that normally your course includes an internship, which I join you and I sympathize that it hasn't been entirely viable during COVID. So internships, of course, are a great way to get your foot in the door, especially if you're an early career professional. So maybe you've been in the workforce for 0 years or 2 to 3 years. Internships are a great foot in the door. Otherwise, if you have started to hone an area of expertise, maybe you're a very strong proposal writer, maybe you are developing an expertise in countering migrant smuggling and human trafficking, then internships may not be the right place for you, especially if you have something like 5 to 7 years work experience. And so what I would suggest is for cases where you have some experience, it gets more and more competitive. I'm not going to lie to you. When we were recruiting for an M&E officer, I think the short list that HR gave me included 90 applications. So these are 90 applicants who met all the eligibility criteria and submitted strong applications. I was surprised to see 10 applicants had PhDs in related areas. And so it is a very competitive process. It's not impossible. Where applicants maybe don't help themselves is when the application is incomplete, it's full of typos or errors, and it's not tailored. This is probably my number one tip to you, whether you want to apply for positions at IOM, in the international development sector, or really anywhere. And any of you who have already joined the workforce or maybe are working as you do this master's, you'll see a lot of applicants are very vague, are very general. And as soon as you read the first line of the cover letter, you know this person has copy-pasted a cover letter. For a sector such as ours, for the UN, this is not just our work. So most of us in the UN, we don't see this as a career, but we see this as a vocation. And so that drive and that commitment to the SDGs, to partnerships, to the work that we do is really important. And when applicants don't demonstrate this by showing us that they've done research on the role itself, but also on the agency, or if we don't see that they've really even looked at our strategies, our annual reports, then we kind of move along, because there are many applicants that you can tell have really done their best to understand what the organization is about, what that particular mission's priorities are, what that particular role they're applying for is looking for. And so I would say very, very important, especially if you are more than early career, if you're mid-career or senior, to take the time to really communicate your commitment. And this is best articulated in your cover letter. Something else that I invite those that ask me to do is also to send very short cover letter type emails, which then makes it easier for us to forward it to colleagues. So when we see a 5-page CV and then a 3-page cover letter, I'll be very frank, I don't think we have the time to read all of that. And so whenever you apply, whether it's a formal application process, if you're reaching out to a contact, I would recommend preparing a very brief, clear of typos, well-designed resume, and then accompanying that with a very short email that captures your interest, what you bring, what you're looking for, and why you're interested in that role in that particular organization. This helps the recipient be able to hit forward and say, I met so-and-so at this event. I don't really know them. They asked me some really great questions. But if you're looking for someone, here's their CV, and the cover letter will follow below. It also shows the reader, their writing skills, and so forth. So this is a very, very personal tip. It's not the UN guidance on how to apply for jobs and secure jobs, but it's a tip that I have passed on to many others who are looking to join the UN or just work in international development. As I said, tailoring your application is really important. In the vacancy notices, you'll see about a third of the TOR, the terms of reference, is focused on core competencies. These are IOM, UN core competencies, and is really important, especially if you are selected for an interview, to speak to them. These core competencies are more values, soft skills that the UN genuinely and very much so values. So I would recommend, especially at the interview stage, to prepare talking points so that you're able to speak to these core competencies as well. Sometimes colleagues don't submit on time, and this is a problem because you spend hours, and UN applications do take hours to fill in, filling out the application form, going to the portal. Sometimes the website crashes. They work on this, but they've missed the deadline, and so the system shuts down. So when we receive applications, I can actually see what time it was submitted, and it's not a big deal, but if you can imagine, there are 200 or 100 shortlisted candidates, 40 that fit what you're looking for, and there's 6 that submitted the application 1 minute before deadline at 11:59 p.m. Because you're shortlisting, you might be led to say, well, that person seems to work under very tight deadlines, maybe not the best time management skills, and so what you want to do is help yourself. So do submit a few days prior to deadline to the extent possible. I'm not saying this will be held against you. If you meet the deadline, you're eligible, but it is something that's worth considering. Also be prepared with your references. UN applications can be very slow, months in the making. I have friends in other agencies, and they didn't hear back about an application for a year. So it can be very slow, but when you hear from an agency, it then works at supersonic speed. And so you'll immediately ask, can you do an interview in 3 days? Can you send me your references? So be prepared. Already reach out to your professional or academic references and say, I'm looking for jobs. I've been applying to these positions. I've drafted a reference for you to comment and send. do what you can to help your referees so that when there is a reference check, they're expecting it. They know that you've asked them to act as a referee, and two, you've given them something to work with. Many references are drafted entirely by the referees, but it's always helpful if you give them a draft as well. It then makes their job easier, which means the response on their end would also be more guaranteed and timely. So these are some quick tips on really applying for jobs in international development, which is the sector I'm most familiar with, but also very much in the UN and IOM sector. And I have to emphasize, these are my personal suggestions, so please don't take this to be the IOM or the UN guidance. If you are looking for specific guidance on applying for UN for a career in the UN, there are endless resources online. I saved here a screenshot of an interview of a guidance from Michael Emery, who at the time of recording was with UNFPA, but is now with IOM, on how to participate in competency-based interviewing. And when I applied for positions, I was on Google, I was on YouTube, trying to figure out, what does this organization look like? What do people that work there say, maybe in blogs, to get a sense. And so what I stumbled across was also this really helpful video on how to participate in competency-based interviews. So if it's helpful for you, I think this is relevant really for any UN position, anything in international development. As I mentioned, when I look for positions, when I looked for jobs, I also Googled, I YouTubed, I read as much as I could. I reviewed the strategy for the country office I was applying in. And that's actually one of maybe the biggest traits I personally look for. We often hear recruiters, employers are looking for professionals that are multitaskers, that are fast learners, which is all true. But one thing that I've come to value more and more as I work in this sector is resourcefulness. When somebody asks me a question that can be answered very easily by Googling, for instance, when in interviewees ask, what is the pay range for this position? I would think, well, it's a multilateral agency, so all of our pay scales and compensation package is publicly available to you. And that kind of indicates to me that maybe you did not do as much research. And I think resourcefulness is a very admirable and necessary skill, a trait. Another one I look for personally is those that take initiative. Instead of waiting for tasks to be assigned, to come and say, in my last position, there was this issue. I thought this might be a solution. I checked with my manager. We did this and that. I think that's an excellent trait to also demonstrate in your application. And of course, we're the UN, so we're a very, very international body. So what we're also very interested in is bringing on board colleagues that are culturally sensitive, that cater to the needs and consider people of all genders. And so being a little bit mindful of the diversity in the staff body itself, but also the people that we work with is really important. So that may be the end of my presentation. I think I went a little bit over time, sorry.
No, you're perfectly fine. Thank you. Yeah, shall we? Thank you very much, Ms. Shraddha. And thank you very much for your energetic presentation. I think, you're actually our first female speaker. So I think, and actually our program tends to be very female dominated. We have very few boys in the group, so we're happy to have a female speaker today, and I think our students were also really excited. So I'm sure we have quite a few questions coming from the students, especially we have at least 2 students who are interested in migration issues for their master's thesis. So yeah, let's go ahead. Questions? Thank you, Ms. Strada. I'm sorry if I pronounce your name wrong. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very insightful, and I just want to ask there is any significant difference in focus on immigrant-friendly policy among nation or sector-wise while you are coordinating a lot of projects in IOM?
Right. Can I just be sure I understand that? Have we come across immigrant-friendly policies?
I would say it's like I would like to know if there is any significant difference when you have to work with different nations or sectors. So, is there any difference in focus on the immigrant policy among such nation or sector-wise?
Okay, excellent question. IOM, like the UN, multilateral agencies, we have member states. We are not, sometimes the UN is described as a global government. We are not at all a global government. We work in coordination and to support member states. And sometimes there may be disagreement between what we believe is important and what the member state prioritizes. Of course, member states go through elections. There are changes in the politics within the member state itself. And so we do not have the authority to enter and say, we insist this is what you do in your country. We can advocate, we can lobby, we can try to explain to them why we think it's important. So for something as, I wouldn't say contentious, but as sensitive as migration, where indeed there is a big variety of positions, not just between our member states, but within a member state. There's definitely a difference sometimes between, and I can't name the member states themselves, but oftentimes the Ministry of Foreign Affairs approach policy rules and regulations concerning migrants can be different to the Ministry of Justices. And so you're talking about the same individual, but two ministries in the same government have two very different approaches or views. And so IOM's work is not to tell them what to do, instead to help member states manage as best possible. This does mean that there is a lot of difference between member states within a member state itself. These are sometimes a challenge, but sometimes an opportunity. We, in the UN, as you would have come across in your studies, we constantly coordinate between member states, between agencies, and so identifying globally agreed goals, such as the SDGs, can take years in the making. IOM is the custodian of the Global Compact for Migration, and as the custodians of GCM, we are also the coordinator for the UN Network on Migration. And even then, there are subtle differences where certain member states will say, I don't object to GCM, but I will not sign or ratify this. And so, but we still support your objectives. And so there's definitely a lot of differences in how policy is formulated and how that policy is then implemented via programs and projects. But the bottom line is we do not tell governments what to do. We're looking to support them. And our interest, of course, is to ultimately provide safe, orderly migration. I'm not sure that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. It's actually answering my question. Well, if I understand it correctly, this is the mutual understanding and compromise among sectors are highly important. And following that question, I would like to ask, what kind of standards were for IOM when choosing a potential destination to implement immigrant support project? Is it also based on the how can I say, the potential to reach agreement among different stakeholders, or something like that?
Absolutely. Okay, you sound like a project developer already. So very much so. When we design a project, when we identify partners, what we do, where we do, is a very long-running consultation. There is usually a group that sits together. So we conceptualize, we discuss the needs, we discuss who's the best partner, what are the resources that we need. But this isn't something we just come up with on the spot. IOM is guided by our mandate. All of the UN agencies, I would say never implement an action that is not related to an SDG, but each agency also has its own strategic priorities. For us at IOM, our current, so 2019 to 2023 strategic vision is focused on resilience, governance, and mobility. So we consider our individual mandate. Then we also look at the member states' priorities. Sometimes they have national action plans and they haven't implemented everything on their NAFs. Sometimes there are 5-year development plans, and we see that there is an area that IOM could support. So what we design is never in a vacuum. At the first instance, we consider what is our mandate, what is the partner agency's mandate, but we won't intervene unless the government is interested, the host member state. And all of this, of course, is then based on the specific intervention. And we are a big organization, so we have many internal policies and procedures to also follow. So, for instance, we have a percentage of the budget that has to go to overhead. We have certain procurement guidelines, so it goes at the macro, but also the specific project level.
Thank you very much. It's quite interesting to hear about that.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I was on mute.
Thank you, Nyan-san, for all the questions. Do we have any other questions? Oh, it looks like we have a question in the chat box.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Can you see?
Yes. I figured that much out on Zoom. My capacity is being built today. Border movements for migrants. Okay, yeah. So borders are a key site for IOM on migration because, of course, this is where immigrants are coming in to the country and immigrants are leaving. During COVID, this was a heightened priority area. This brought together our migration health experts, our integrated border management experts, because, of course, up until then, for the most part, borders were more procedural. So passport verification, referral services in case the migrant may have been trafficked or smuggled. So very much around the functional aspects of movement. During COVID, this functional aspect married health, urgent health needs and requirements. And so, as I mentioned, during COVID, we provided a lot of training to border checkposts on COVID regulations to ensure that movement at points of entry abided by agreed standards. So this could be, in some cases, this included providing PPE. In other cases, it included providing training. In other cases, it included working with the member states to identify what is your protocol, what's your action should a migrant test positive. What will you do then? So at the actual borders itself, but also advocating for migrants' access to vaccines. We're very lucky to live in a time where vaccines were developed as quickly as they were, but you'll recall just last year, vaccines were gold, right? Not everybody had equal access. And so IOM worked very hard to advocate for the inclusion of migrants in vaccine drives. And we saw this in my home country that I'm very proud of, in Nepal, where they said, regardless of migration status, refugee, migrant, citizen, everybody has equal access to vaccines. We saw this in a handful of countries where member states said, it's COVID. It's not that migrants don't get COVID or migrants will not pass COVID, so everybody has access. And so this was a very, very important area of work, and one that IOM, we intend to keep building on. Experts are telling us that this is a global pandemic and they expect more. And so what we our experience working at points of entry. So health-based border management is kind of a case study for us. We don't know what the next pandemic will be like, but at least we have some tools and measures in place. So this became a key area and will continue to be a priority.
Thank you very much for your answer.
Yeah, thank you. I think you're on mute.
So clearly, I'm not very good with Zoom either. So I think Nyan-san raised her hand first. So Nyan-san probably has a follow-up question on your answer, right, Nyan-san?
Yes, but I can pass it to Philip if he needs to ask first, because I think I asked too many questions.
Right. I know that Nyan-san is interested in the health policies for immigrants. So, okay, maybe we can ask Philip to go ahead.
Okay, I don't mind waiting, Nyan-san, if you have your question.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah, don't worry.
I'll be quick. So I would like to ask a question following that. Since the COVID epidemic is still ongoing, and I know it's very hard to evaluate any successful project, and I know IOM has been also working on a lot of healthcare access for immigrants during the pandemic. And could you share with us any successful story that you think are outstanding right now?
Actually, that's a very nice question to talk about success, because development can be a lonely space where we don't see progress within our lifetime. So we are one cog in a large machine, and the brick we put on, we don't see the impact right away. So that's a very encouraging question. And yes, we did see a lot of success. I would say Cambodia. We led a joint UN initiative to support the return and reintegration of stranded migrant workers from the southeast sub-region. So as you might recall, it's so bizarre to me that just last year it was so chaotic, and yet already it's a testament to what humankind can do when we collaborate. So last year, you might recall, there was a very painful period where migrant workers were stranded. You would have seen in the news domestic workers in New Delhi walking for days to go back to their villages, and it was a very heartbreaking situation. We had similar cases of migrant workers. Migrant workers don't always earn a great wage. So while already we were working on migrant workers' rights, on decent work, during COVID, employers did not feel comfortable having domestic workers, having migrant workers. Factories were shutting down. Residences were not wanting to keep migrants in their giving rent to them. And so there were a lot of stranded migrants. Those with needs and resources. So the very privileged of us have passport, have money in the bank to book flights, to pay for 2-week-long quarantines. But more of the world does not have that kind of resource available to them. And so in Cambodia, there were a lot of stranded migrant workers in the sub-region trying to get back home. But even when they got back to Cambodia, they were penniless. And so without money, they don't have a job. Their children still need to be taken care of. And so we had a return and reintegration support that was set up. And there's so much to be done to reach. Ideally we share our resources and everybody on earth has their basic needs met. But in that case, we did reach a number of migrants, and it was a very satisfying moment. And I myself was very proud of the IOM Cambodia team. They were exposing themselves to COVID. It was a chaotic period. It required a lot of coordination between government with other agencies. And at the same time, there are individuals whose lives not just were saved, but were really valued. And I think that's at the core of what we want to do in the UN and in international development, to show that regardless of race, religion, income, nationality, your life is of value. And I think we're able to demonstrate that to a few. But since you asked, on the IOM public website, there is a COVID achievements report for that's publicly available, and a lot of it, of course, is around health, and it includes this particular success story.
Yes, thank you. It's very an eye-opening story because I know IOM has been focused a lot on immigrants in host nation, and it's interesting to see that they also focus on the return immigrants.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much for your answer.
Sure.
So, Philip, we have just 3 more minutes. Let's get going.
Okay, yes, thank you. I'll be short. Thank you for the presentation. I'm very interested in IOM work, and specifically I would like to know more about field work, if you can tell us a little bit more about that, especially now, let's say, for example, that what happened in Tonga a couple of weeks ago. Is there any cooperation with other bodies of the Tonga's government or maybe other international organizations? Or how does that work? Is there just like a project writing, or there is some actual field work happening in IOM?
Mm-hmm. Yes. There is a lot of direct interventions. So IOM, we call ourselves a projectized agency because we're working on policies, we're working on developing guidelines, but we also implement directly. So Tonga is a recent example where in the immediate aftermath, we had an office there already. It's a small office, but we had an office there already, and we always would coordinate with the member states. So the National Disaster Management Office, NDMO, which I think in Tonga is the National Emergency Management Office. So we work with the related disaster emergencies agency from the government. We would not go in and decide to distribute relief kits. We would talk to the relevant body and say, we've done a quick assessment, we have this many boots on the ground, we have this kind of resources, we think these areas should be prioritized, these were the hardest hit part of the hurricane, would you agree, what do you think? They might say, we have a shifting priority, there are other agencies that are covering this part of the country, can you focus here? So it's a very quick, very rapid-paced discussion. Longer-term development, we can have the luxury of discussing and theorizing, which is necessary because it's long-term impact. For emergencies like that, we have a roster of emergency specialists. We have experts in emergency management who, depending on the need and context, can be deployed immediately to coordinate. We are part of the UN, of course, so there's the cluster system. IOM is the co-lead on camp management. So 2 years ago, there was volcanic eruptions on Ambay Island in Vanuatu. So immediately after that volcano erupted, we had displacement tracking. They did quick assessments. How many people were displaced? How many are women-headed households that are maybe more vulnerable? How many have children? Where did they move to? What's their needs? And then IOM will come immediately and secure funds to say, okay, IOM can contribute 6,000 tents and tarps. It'll be procured from our warehouse in this mission. It'll take 2 weeks. What can be done in the meantime? So emergencies is a very, very stressful scenario, and we have it's probably half of our portfolio.
Thank you for your answer.
Well, we're right on time. It's 3 o'clock, so I think we'll have to let Ms. Shada go. So thank you very much. I feel like we had a really active Q&A session today, so that was good to see. And yes, thank you very much for taking 1 hour out of your very busy schedule, and talking to us. I think our students also enjoyed it very much. Mr. Hua, can we take a quick photo?
Yes, sure. Everyone, please turn on your camera.
Yeah. Everybody, just quickly turn on your camera if you can. If you're
Okay.
here, everyone. Okay. Mr. Hua this time.
Okay. On the count of 3, okay?
Okay.
3. Okay, wait. Just wait a bit. Okay, everyone is on. 3, 2, 1. Okay, we've got it. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Ms. Shraddha. I hope to see you soon in person in a couple of years. So, yes, thank you very much. We'll stay in touch. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for
so
your time.
much. Thank you
very much for your
time.
My pleasure.
Bye, everyone. Have a
Thank you.
good day.
Have a good rest of the afternoon.
You
Bye.
too.